All right. So who was responsible for the battle being where it was? You seem to...
I'm not me. Don't blame me.
Yeah, not blaming you. But you seem to say that John Reynolds had one of the largest impacts on that, and they just didn't blunder into Gettysburg either, for that matter.
One of the
And what about Winfield Scott Hancock?
Right.
The same?
One of the conventional stories about Gettysburg is that the battle was an accident. The two armies accidentally collide with each other. That is not really true. Both the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia had a reasonably good idea where each was. And Lee especially had put his finger down on a map, speaking to Isaac Trimble, and said, we will probably fight the Army of the Potomac there, indicating
How early did you
Gettysburg.
say that?
It's about 4 or 5 days before the battle. Okay. And the reason for that was Lee had sent most of the Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania in a long arc. Part of the arc had stopped at Chambersburg. Richard Ewell's corps continued that arc all the way up to Carlisle, all the way to a point where they could look over the Susquehanna River and see Harrisburg. And the idea had been, draw the Army of the Potomac north. Draw it in confusion, draw it straggling, draw it panting and rushing to catch up. On the 28th of June, Lee orders a concentration. He pulls all of his units away from what had been this long arc, pulls them back to concentrate at Gettysburg. The idea being that he will have Powell Hill's corps on one side of Gettysburg, Richard Ewell's corps on the other side, and Longstreet's corps right up behind them, all within supporting distance of each other right in the Gettysburg vicinity. What he had not reckoned on was John Reynolds, because Reynolds insisted on getting to Gettysburg first. Strictly speaking, he shouldn't.
Outside of his orders.
Outside of his orders, because strictly speaking, he shouldn't have been there. When George Meade took command of the Army of the Potomac, Meade's understanding of his orders was protect Baltimore, protect Washington. That was it. That's the prime directive. And his strategy for doing that was to entrench the Army of the Potomac behind Pipe Creek, which is a tributary of the Monocacy River, and dig in there. It's a good defensive position. What's more, it has Westminster and the railhead of the Western Maryland Railroad right behind it, so he's got a very easy supply line. Dig the Army of the Potomac there and defy Lee to attack you at Pipe Creek. But Reynolds, and this was still, shall we say, some of the momentum of Joe Hooker's plan to swing west, Reynolds was out in front, and Reynolds was determined not to abandon Pennsylvania to Lee. Reynolds says very clearly that I am concerned that by pulling back behind Pipe Creek, Meade is going to allow Lee to run riot through Pennsylvania. Well, Reynolds is a Pennsylvanian. And his people are from Lancaster, the big landowners in the Lancaster area. He knew the area very well. He was devoted to it. He is determined this is not going to happen. And so he pushes his own corps, the 1st Corps, and the 2 other corps that were under his direction, the 11th Corps and the 3rd Corps. He's pushing them forward. And when John Buford, who was acting as his cavalry screen, when John Buford reports that he's encountered Confederate infantry at Fairfield, then on June 30th reports that there are Confederate infantry milling around outside to the west of Gettysburg, Reynolds lunges forward. He meets with Oliver Otis Howard, the commander of the 11th Corps, the evening before, the evening of June 30th, and says, we're going to move up to Gettysburg, and particularly what we want to hold is Cemetery Hill. And he wanted Cemetery Hill south of Gettysburg because Cemetery Hill is the perfect artillery platform. It is one of the most ideal formations for artillery, for sighting artillery in south central Pennsylvania. Reynolds is an old artillery officer. That was his original posting, was in the 3rd Artillery. Reynolds wants to move up. He wants to get to Gettysburg. He does not want to allow the Confederates to do more than they have done in Pennsylvania. And in fact, when he does get up to Gettysburg, the last message he sends back to Meade through Captain Stephen Weld is, I understand that this is not the way you wanted things to happen, but I have decided to exercise my discretion and hold on to Gettysburg. I'm going to fight west of the town. I'm going to barricade the streets if I have to. And the implication was, would you please bring the rest of the army up and support?
Now, Hancock came up.
Hancock comes up because when Meade gets this message, Meade is at Taneytown, Maryland. It's about 12 miles away. And Meade does not want to respond right away. So he sends Hancock up to Gettysburg in his place to see this. It's very ambiguous what Hancock's exact responsibility was, because technically speaking, what Meade should have done was to have sent his chief of staff, Dan Butterfield, except that he loathed Dan Butterfield, and he was not sending Butterfield up there. So he turns to the person who is closest to him politically, Winfield Scott Hancock, most reliable, and sends Hancock up there. Hancock gets up to Gettysburg late in the day of July 1st, when the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps had been beaten back to Cemetery Hill. And he gets up there and he sees Otis Howard. And the first thing they do is have an argument about who has seniority. That's a great. It reflects so credibly on everybody. Then they're in this battle. They've just had the army's just had its head knocked around, and these two guys are arguing about who's got seniority. Well, Hancock says, "Okay, I really do think this is a good position. I will send word back to Meade that we should fight here." Meade finally arrives at Cemetery Hill in the wee hours of July 2nd, probably around 2 in the morning. And it's then that Meade says, "Well, all right, we'll stay here and fight." One general says to him, "General, this is a wonderful position." Well, he says, "I'm glad you said that because it's the only position." I mean, not exactly the most enthusiastic endorsement. But Meade then proceeds from there to concentrate the Army of the Potomac. And he does it, and this is credit to Meade, he concentrates the Army very quickly. Much more quickly, in fact, than Lee is able to complete the concentration of his own. And it is a question of who gets there first with the most, to paraphrase a general from the West. It really is a case of who gets there first with the most at Gettysburg, and it's Meade.
Yeah. Yes, it was an affecting moment in the book when I read that Hancock, on his way to Gettysburg, passed by the body of Reynolds going the opposite direction.
Yeah.
That must have been a tough moment.
Hancock's
Did he
chief
ever
of
say
staff
anything
afterwards
about
said that a great silence fell on all of Hancock's staff, and they didn't do any more chit-chat all the way up to Gettysburg.
Out in the West again.
Uh-huh.
Since you brought up the West again, we have to get there. The Navy had a part in this, it seems.
Yes.
And did they save the day?
Oh, very definitely.
What happened?
They did. The gunboat Lexington and Choctaw arrived, and in fact, the Choctaw was there. There was anticipation that the Confederates might try to make a raid on some of these river outposts. And so the Choctaw was there, and as the Confederates advanced, began throwing, heavy artillery into their ranks. Now, for the most part, the river was down, and there was a bluff, and so, and then you had a couple of levees after that. So the Choctaw really couldn't see where they were shooting. They had to rely on somebody on the land to tell them, high or left, whichever way. But for the most part, what happened was the Confederates advanced. The African Brigade was very quickly overwhelmed. They were flanked. It was just going very badly. And then there were 2 companies from the 11th Louisiana, which actually, that's a Union unit, despite its name. The 11th Louisiana, African descent, was 2 companies were holding tight on the far right of the Union line. Everybody else was just getting beat up. But these guys held firm. And they, along with the gunboats, really kept the Confederates from just completely running everybody into the river. And so they really were the saviors of the day. The old, Western cliche of here comes the cavalry. Well, here comes the gunboats, and they saved the day. And what was really interesting to me as I looked into it more closely was that all of the newspaper coverage, well, I can't say all, but much of the newspaper coverage in the North proclaimed the bravery of the black troops. Because again, this was very, very new. This was very early in the whole organization of the USCTs. And most of the newspapers left out the fact that the gunboats were there. And so, they kind of skewed it a little bit. And of course, especially, the abolitionist press, they certainly, pumped that up. And even, the Assistant Secretary of War in his report, he didn't mention the gunboats. And even when he submitted another report a couple of days later, and he made a few corrections to his initial report, he still didn't mention the gunboats. So, they're kind of like the large hulking craft that's there that nobody's talking about.
But there they came in.
Absolutely.
And did save that day. I'm going to put both of you to work for a few moments. Okay. We're already 56 minutes into this, and we've hardly touched battle. Mm-hmm. Maybe my proclivities on this one, and good talk.
You just don't like military history.
That must be it. Back in my school days, obviously, in academia. And I'll have you also begin here.
So that puts me then on the whole trail about, what about Jeb Stuart? I'm skeptical of the whole notion that somehow Jeb Stuart lost the Battle of Gettysburg for Robert E. Lee by launching on this joyride that took him way into Maryland, all the way down, in fact, to Georgetown, right to the outskirts of Washington, and then back up to Hanover, back up to Carlisle, and finally rejoins the Army of Northern Virginia late on July 2nd. Did that cripple Lee? Was Lee thus deprived of his eyes and ears, as it is often said? Well, only if cavalry, in fact, provided eyes and ears. But it didn't. Cavalry does not do intelligence gathering in the Civil War. And the reason that it doesn't is because the cavalry of the American Civil War is entirely light cavalry. There's no heavy cavalry units, such as you might find in European armies at the time. Partly that's because both the Union and Confederate governments were too cheap. Heavy cavalry was very, very expensive to maintain. Light cavalry was the only thing that in the American experience they had any training for, and they had any track record for. So the cavalry in the American Civil War is light cavalry. What's more, there's less of it than there is in the European armies. The ratio of cavalry to infantry in the American Civil War armies is about half that of the ratio of cavalry to infantry in the European armies of the same decades. What light cavalry did was basically two things: screening and raiding. It did not do intelligence. Intelligence gathering was done by spies and scouts, and Lee had spies and scouts aplenty, which is why Lee was not fumbling around in the dark for want of Jeb Stuart.
But would have screening helped know where Reynolds was, for instance?
Screening would have helped on July 1st. It would have prevented Harry Heath's division from blundering into Gettysburg. But that's very different from saying that Jeb Stuart lost the battle because he wasn't providing Robert E. Lee with intelligence. That is simply not the case. Intelligence did not come from the cavalry. Screening, yes. And Stuart is culpable for launching off into this useless joyride. I am the last one to try to tell you that Jeb Stuart is a great military genius. He was not. But at the same time, he does not and should not have to bear the burden of guilt that is slewed onto his shoulders by people who want to say, well, this is the man that caused it all. Any more than I think we should accept people who want to slew all the responsibility for Gettysburg onto Dick Ewell's shoulders for not pressing on the evening of July 1st, or for James Longstreet for not attacking early on the morning of July 2nd or early in the morning on July 3rd, ignoring the fact that his troops were not in position on either of those days and he had no control over that.